So, welcome to today's Contagion Cultures webinar. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the land where I am now and in Calgary, Alberta. I would like to acknowledge that I live and work on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nation, the Switina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda Nations, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nation. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. As an outsider, I also would like to share a more personal note. I want to express my gratitude to the Indigenous people for their historical and continuous struggle protecting this beautiful land. Walking around for more than a year has been a healing alternative to isolation. For their resilience and inspiring history, I'm grateful. Thank you. So, the Contagion Cultures series is a Faculty of Arts and Science collaboration between the School of Policy Studies and Languages, Literatures and Cultures, with Queen's Library providing substantive support. These talks are live streamed Tuesdays at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. The series will continue until the end of the winter term. The next talk, this is a promo, is on April 13, entitled The Book Industry After COVID by guest speaker Julien Lefebvre, assistant professor at the Department of French Studies. Queen's Contagion Culture lectures help make sense of this pandemic through the expertise and insights of arts and science faculty members. This public-facing series leverages the powerful tools of humanistic analysis to grapple with our turbulent times. To ask questions, please submit them by typing them into the Q&A feature that you can find at the lower middle of your screen. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce Jennifer Ruth Hosek. She is a professor in Queen's Language, Literatures and Cultures Department, cross-appointed with Film and Media Studies and with Gender Studies, and affiliated with the Cultural Studies Graduate Program and the Queen's University of Havana Exchange. Dr. Hosek spearheaded this Faculty of Arts and Science and School of Policy Studies webinar series, Contagion Cultures, with Warren Maybe. Her transnational approach to culture focuses on Cuba and Europe, concretely Germany. One of Jennifer's current larger projects investigates non-petrocultural urban movement and includes the co-direct award-winning documentary Rodando en La Habana, Bicycle Stories. Her work includes the monograph Some, Sex and Socialism, Cuba in the German Imaginary, co-edited anthologies on Berlin and on Christa Wolf, and the peer-to-peer language tandem web platform 3wlingualive.ca. Her talk today is entitled Media and Money in the Time of Vaccine, Cuba's Unique Health Strategy. Jennifer told me that this is a relatively new interest for her, as the COVID trapped us into our houses more than a year ago. She has been observing and researching the singularities of the Cuban approach to the pandemic, including the programs to create a vaccine that allows for Cuba's sovereignty. With its 5 vaccine candidates in different phases and 2 in the third phase of the clinical trials, Cuba presents a unique scenario to enter the state-driven practices associated with healthcare, the socialized understanding of scientific knowledge and practices, and also the media interventions in social landscape. In this presentation, Jennifer will map some fascinating features located on the intersections of media, money, and health crisis, anchoring her analysis in the context of Cuba, a country in which governmental policies normally generate extreme passions. Jennifer is not only a scholar studying Cuba, she is a respectful one, an enthusiast when addressing our successes and failures, our findings and disappointments. Let's welcome Jennifer with this initial approach to media and money in the time of vaccine, Cuba's unique health strategy. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Senya, and thank you for coming to introduce me. It's an honor to have you here. And I also would like to start with an acknowledgement, and I'm taking a cue from one of the Indigenous scholars here at Queens when I suggest that we take a moment of silence to think about what it means to each one of us to live and to work and to play on these lands. Yeah, so thank you for coming to this, one of the last Contagion Cultures talks for this winter term 2021. When I approached Queens about starting a webinar series shortly before, after we went virtual in March 2020, I certainly did not imagine that the series would last more than a semester or two. Currently, we plan to reinitiate Contagion Cultures with the start of fall classes 2021. I'm happy that through these webinars, Queen's faculty have been able to contribute robustly to diverse thinking about this pandemic, especially thinking about it in relation to equity and to how changing how we live can decrease the probability and the intensity of future extreme occurrences such as this. At the same time as most of us, I'll be grateful when changes to our circumstances make this project not obsolete, but less up close and personal. I'd also like to particularly thank my students in our Contagion Cultures seminar in Languages, Literatures, and Cultures who've come voluntarily at this very busy time of the semester. And of course, all my colleagues and friends who came at this busy time as well. My somewhat informal, perhaps somewhat polemical work in progress contribution today expands from research that I did for the seminar and also for the short article that was published in The Conversation on March 16th. So that was 3 weeks ago. Things are moving so fast these days. It's entitled The Scene from Cuba, How It's Getting So Much Right on COVID. After this event, a document with additional resources will be sent to each registrant. And this document includes work by Amilcar Perez Rivarol, a Cuban virologist, whom I had hoped to have as a special guest today, but whose partner has just given birth. In the spirit of this, I have a bit of mass rash. In the spirit of DIY, instead of sharing screen with a PowerPoint, I'm just going to keep us going with these little markers. So vaccine projection screen Cuba. As Cuba gets closer and closer to vaccine rollout, international coverage about it has been increasing. I assert that the international media has been getting interested in Cuba's success with vaccine candidate research only in part because this small island seems to be, as the Washington Post recently writes, managing this feat against the odds. In large, the international media is interested in Cuba's feat because of the many fiascos in vaccine development, production, and rollout in what are considered typically more developed countries. It's less that Cuba is interesting for Cuba's sake. It's more that Cuba is interesting to many in the global south, in the global north, for various sakes of our own. It's commonly understood, notably in philosophy and critical theory, that we know ourself in relation to the other. And so we know that other in terms of ourself, that is on our own terms. And yet it seems to me that from the global north, some entities are more frequently and more robustly deployed as projection screens. Some entities are more prone to overdetermination and more prone to politicized polarization. And Cuba is one of these entities. One symptom of this phenomenon of projection is the range of responses to my article. The conversation aims for a more diverse readership than academic journals. And yet this audience factor is not enough to explain the radically different responses to it. They range from attacks on my person to attacks on the Cuban government about issues quite unrelated to the healthcare system, to effusive praise for the Cuban government and/or Cuba and/or Cuba's beaches, to critiques of healthcare systems of other nations. These responses have more to do with the interests of respondents than with Cuba. Not that they're unjustified because of that, I just think it's important to recognize it. And thinking through this reminded me of my monograph in which I was precisely concerned with Germans' receptions of Cuba in relation to their own hopes for and critiques of their nation and their world. During this talk, then, I will be situating myself, taking note to the best of my abilities of the ways in which my interest in Cuba during the pandemic has been related to my own concerns around the pandemic, particularly in relation to other countries that I follow most for my work, US and Germany. And at the same time, I'll also be attempting to analyze Cuba dispassionately. Since the pandemic hit, I've been glued to the news. I was worried a lot, and I was worried about Cuba. It has low hard currency flow, infrastructural problems, and an elderly population. And Cuba also has the same types of health concerns as overdeveloped countries: obesity, diabetes, hypertension, all pre-existing conditions. I grew up in Germany, a well-organized, high socioeconomic status country with a fabulous and universal medical care system. Germany did fabulously well in the first wave due to a transparent science-first policy and calm, effective leadership, Chancellor Angela Merkel. And somebody needs to write a dissertation about female leadership during the pandemic, because so many countries have been doing so well under that leadership. To go back to this talk, I know intimately what it's like in the US, a country without universal coverage. And then from the early months of the pandemic, friends and colleagues in China talked with me about the tough situation there. So nightmaring on Cuba, I was imagining mass graves like those of New York City's Hart Island or Quito's and Manaus cadavers in the streets. But in Cuba, the virus didn't spread uncontrolled. Moreover, fatalities remained very low. The free and universal Cuban medical system is, of course, famed. And from firsthand experience, I also know that treatments and medicines are often scarce due to material poverty. So why exactly was Cuba doing so well? So I did what profs do when they don't know. I started reading more. And recommendations for your possible future reading, especially my students, are linked in my article, and some that I'll highlight here. The Havana-based independent documentary company Belly of the Beast is doing some great on-the-ground reporting. And particularly relevant also is the medical research organization MEDIC and Helen Yaffe's new book. They variously chronicle Cuba's breathtaking decision leading into the dire economic situation at the end of the Cold War. What was it? To use precious assets to develop biotech, medical, and other scientific resources. This infrastructure is key to Cuba's success now. So in this way, I discovered actually it makes absolute sense that Cuba is beating COVID. Cuba puts people ahead of profit and prevention of illness ahead of mitigation of illness. So not end of pipe solution, just stop it before it starts. So nearly a month later, I still agree with this, which is what I said in the article. And then as I say to my students, writing is a process and publications are thought milestones. So now I add that Cuba puts science first ahead of politicization. With this assertion, I do not mean to say that Cuba's people first, science first approach is not political. Consider reporting by news outlets that are not particularly pro-Cuba, such as Financial Times, CNN, Miami Herald, CTV, Deutsche Welle. Cuba and the Cuban government's pandemic response to date is strengthening its reputation, even while Cuba's economy is under increasing pressure and scarcity is widespread. When I say that Cuba is putting science ahead of politicization, I mean that it's putting protocols that serve the populace ahead of protocols that serve powerful and moneyed interests. I will now highlight what I see as crucial aspects of pandemic responses, and I'll talk about Cuba's particular responses to these challenges. Aspect 1, coordination and collaboration. Extensive media review convinces me that emergency response needs to be pre-planned, centrally organized, and collaborative. We shouldn't find ourselves building the bicycle and the bicycle path while trying to ride on it, down it. Right here in Canada, the pandemic response is being hampered by federalism. Dr. Kumanan Wilson of the Ottawa Hospital and also a Queen's Research Associate made precisely this argument in this Contagion Cultures series. He imagines and argues for a Canadian vaccine services that is seamless, like the now well-oiled machine that is the Canadian Blood Services. Cuba has built a seamless system for healthcare since 1959. It reinforced this system in the 1980s and 90s when Cuba became completely independent from the Soviet Union. Furthermore, organizations, groups, and individuals collaborate to solve big problems, whether it's a hurricane or a pandemic. Of course, none of this is perfect, but it's really there and it is robust. And it's a tradition, it's a habit, it's a practice. This long deployed protocol holds Cuba in good stead now. Categorical detractors of today's Cuba may point to the ways that centralist, arguably authoritarian governance furthers such successful responses. They may say that ends do not justify means. It seems to me if we translate this into pandemic terms, they must then mean that the ends of low infection rates and ultra low death rates do not justify what they see as the detriments of a system that is not market driven in the US version of the term. Other skeptics on the left of the spectrum, for instance, brilliant thinkers such as Mike Davis, also warn against centralization. Davis argues that humanity should not see centralization as a superior governance structure going forward, simply because extreme events such as climate intensification and disease will become more common. So I'm not making a plea for de-democratization of countries who self-identify as democratic. And I would like to offer some further perspectives. One, I recommend James Miller's Contagion Cultures talk. And the second, I'm going to share an excerpt of an email message from a former student of mine who's now in China, where they write, "Now our life is the same as the past, except for the mask on the face and everyday infection. So we thank the strict measures, although at the beginning, not everyone accepted them." What follows is their personal point of view, shared with permission, of course, in response to my question to them last month. The question was, what does the Chinese cultural imaginary, like what do people typically think about how the West has been handling the pandemic, whether, for instance, it's seen as having been mismanaged? So the response, it's hard to copy the Chinese government's and the Chinese people's responses to the virus because of the radically different social systems and cultures. In fact, most people here are rational about the failure of COVID control in the West. But in the long term, the mismanagement will have a greater impact than the virus itself, because some Western countries are using fake news to smear China. They attribute their failure to China. By attributing their failure to China, Western countries are increasing racism towards China. And let me mention here that this point about scapegoating has been variously analyzed by Adati Sin, Ali Na, and Jenna Healy in their Contagion Cultures talks that are available for your use for teaching and reference in general. All of them are. To continue the students' comments, I think that the Western world I think the Western world misunderstands us. Some people think that the Chinese are forced to follow the government without their own thinking. It's completely false. And in fact, we care much about our liberties. In the beginning, many people questioned the effect and the worth of the mask, the quarantine, the social distance, including the scan code, which is a tracking app for individual phones. We care much about our privacy, but because the virus spread so fast and there is no specific medicine to cure it, even now, the vaccine is not 100% effective. So we have to follow these stringent measures, even if we don't want to. If liberty is at the expense of other lives, most Chinese people will not do that. So we are very confused that some Western people still have big parties, go to the beach, gather together during the emergency period. If that is the liberty the Western world suggests, it is like a joke. So that is one of Queen's students' opinions sent from China. What I'm suggesting for Western countries is more along the lines of Dr. Kumanan Wilson's recommendation regarding a national Canadian vaccine services. We need to have central response plans ready to be deployed when non-human actors, when non-human actor disasters occur. I differentiate here between disasters caused by human actors and those caused by non-human actors. So for instance, when humans bombed the World Trade Center, the US government took this event as a pretext for governmental overreach. They abridged civil liberties at home, and they started foreign wars abroad. I'm talking about crisis management triggered by non-human actors. As one of my students wrote, the virus isn't picky. Given the virus's wanton power, we need to work in concert to fight it, putting people ahead of market-powered political interests. Aspect 1, coordination and collaboration, case study, media messaging. An understudied aspect of Cuba's coordinated response is media messaging. Cuba typically uses media messaging in times of crisis. For instance, public service spots encourage mosquito abatement in homes to stop mosquito-borne illness like Zika and dengue. The work around COVID has been particularly robust, certainly in part because state employees in creative industries are isolating. They continue to be paid, and they're expected to, and they want to help. So detractors here might call to mind the classic example of the Nazi Gleichschaltung, during which Germany's media resources were put under the direct control of the Ministry of Propaganda. To which I respond, the virus isn't picky, and it's a non-human actor. We need to work together with all our resources to beat it. Quick concept, least restrictive alternative. A May 2020 discussion on vaccine passports in the website of the Journal of the American Medical Association deploys the concept of least restrictive alternative when considering the ethics of these passports. Applying this concept to Cuban media, government-supported public service announcements are a least restrictive alternative, given that mitigation measures must be taken. Further, a November 2020 Nature article ranking COVID-19 government interventions found that highly effective, cost-effective, consensus-based non-pharmaceutical interventions feature the following: risk communication strategies that include government actions intended to educate and actively communicate with the public. The study also found that these strategies should be tailored for particular demographics in order to be the most effective. Cuba's media messaging is a least restrictive, effective, consensus-based, non-pharmaceutical intervention according to these criteria featured in JAMA and Nature. It's especially on target because this messaging is adapted to many different demographics. Among other examples, my article includes a Cuban animation studio's International Workers' Day cartoon. In it, Cuban cartoon characters, particularly loved by children, celebrate May 1st from their windows and balconies. This cartoon is modeling pandemically correct behavior for Cuban youngsters that is also itself an example of how the Cuban government is putting health above politics. One might say that the government is making public health their politics by canceling the emblematic in-person official march in Revolution Square. In contrast, big money in-person political gatherings have become super spreader events in many countries. And Senya is going to share screen for the second example now. This second, you can just start it, Senya, while I'm talking, it's fine. The second animation example now, this one is from the New Latin American Film Festival, and it's geared towards adults. When we checked our tech and we had sound, but here it is. This adult-oriented animation blends the ambiance of a sophisticated urban film festival with that of a pandemic that calls for physical distancing and calm. The cool minimalist color palette features bruised greens, blues, and purples and fills angular and clean shapes. Crisp light beams and shadows evoke a movie projector and the tilted filming of a slightly off-kilter world. The initial sweaty tension in the doctor's face and his crumpling of the receipt for paracetamol suggests the frustrations during this pandemic, when indeed even a simple acetaminophen is scarce. Then smiles as the doctor pens a hopeful solution alive with color and fluidity, the first dose of cinema. The subsequent panoramic journey from Havana's Revolution Square to Peru's Machu Picchu to Argentina's ski slopes to Brazil's Rio beaches follows each local inhabitant in personalized mask and grasping that doctor's prescription. The images reinforce the global scope of the festival, of the pandemic, and of the need to follow hygiene guidelines. The cartoon camera frames Cuba's beloved National Director of Epidemiology sitting at his desk at his daily televised press briefing, and zooms out until this very Dr. Duran is seated in the ticket booth of the iconic Yara Cinema. The first dose of the 42nd Film Festival, the Panorama series, did take place in physically distanced manner in December 2020. The festival's second dose, the international competition, is planned for November 2021, with the 43rd festival following immediately afterwards in December. Let's hope. Aspect 2, individualism. During this pandemic, I've been thinking a lot about individualism. So is the individual thinking of Hemingway here, an old man fighting the sea, fighting the whale? Or is the individual understood as someone in a self-actualizing dialectic with society, kind of like this talk, right? So many contributed, and I'm the one who's officially speaking. But that's just kind of happenstance in a way. It's all about the community. Let's think about this individualism in relation to the case study of masking. A Cuban researcher who's working on masking recently told me that one of the first principles of COVID that he discovered was that for the individual to remain healthy, the individual needed to keep their community healthy. This notion has become axiomatic for his research team. Their research seeks to discover in how far masks protect their wearer and or the persons around their wearer. His team's aim in this research was to further general knowledge in the international scientific community. Remember, the team takes as axiomatic that the health of the individual is bound to the health of the other. Therefore, for this team, it's improbable that any mask wearer would choose not to mask up if their laboratory results were to demonstrate that wearing a mask protects the others more than the wearer. So I found this conceptualization of individualism relative to mask wearing particularly interesting when considered in relation to messaging around masking in the US and Germany. You may recall that messaging around masking in North America and Europe vacillated precisely around the benefits to the wearer. Early on, US Chief Medical Advisor Dr. Anthony Fauci and one of Germany's leading virologists evaded direct responses to the question of whether to mask. Once people were encouraged to wear masks, the benefits to the wearer were emphasized. And let me say that I do very much respect the work of Fauci and Drosten overall, and nevertheless, they did contribute to this issue. The influential professor of information studies, Zeynep Tufekci, argues that the politicized mixed messaging around masks increased noncompliance. People were discouraged from masking, although the precautionary principle around droplet and air that he and the Centers for Disease Control had not trusted the public. Concerned that consumers would purchase medical-grade masks for themselves, leaving nothing for medical staff, he prevaricated, he even dissimulated. Tufekci's advice is to have leveled with the citizens in a democracy. The US government could also have invoked emergency powers to suspend market norms, to control mask selling, and to increase production. Political maneuvering was as well. Asking citizens to mask up would have drawn attention to the fact that the powerful, rich US was failing its citizens in not maintaining sufficient basics such as PPE. In Germany, 2 conservative politicians received kickbacks for brokering mask deals. Remember that outsourcing due to global market logics meant that most mask production was out of most countries' hands. Finally, in the US and elsewhere, mask wearing famously split along political party lines and along gender lines. Today, the typical non-masker self-identifies as conservative, cis male, and kind of macho. My take-home point is that mask wearing has been very politicized and market slanted in the US and in many other countries since the start of the pandemic. Cuba dealt with masking very differently. The country prepared for mitigation based on best practices from Asia and its own expertise with contagious diseases. As the first cases arrived in March, mask mandates were universally instituted and enforced. The messaging was clear, consistent, constant. Wearing a mask protects you and protects others. Wear a mask. Medical masks were only available in medical facilities and not always. So the Cuban government sent out instructions on social media and mass media about how to fashion masks at home. Neighbors made masks for neighbors, and nowadays artisanally produced masks are sold. Incidentally, the work of the mask researcher has so far garnered little interest among health experts, and he explains it in this way. It's not that the experts aren't interested, it's simply that they know that masks are best practice at the population level, and for now, their time is better spent designing therapeutics, designing ventilators, swabs, and vials domestically. Now here, detractors may complain that hefty fines of about 2,000 CUP, Cuban pesos, are levied upon non-compliers in Cuba. A person working as a teacher in Cuba typically earns around 16,800 CUP per month, including housing, transport, and other benefits. So since little of that amount is actually paid out in income, indeed, 2,000 CUP can easily be double a monthly cash salary. And mask mandates are enforced in many places in the world, sometimes with fines. In France, 135 euro, South Korea, 100,000 won. In Germany, from 25 euro to a whopping 10,000 euro for non-compliance. My focus on masking in the global north drove me to start asking people in Cuba via voice over IP what they thought about masks. Based on the public media messaging, it may not be surprising that nearly all said that mask wearing protected both the wearer and those around them. More surprising was that nobody responded that for them, mask wearing was gendered. Since Cuba is commonly considered a macho society, this answer is particularly interesting. I believe that it can be explained through Cuba's non-politicized, science-first, people-first engagement with the pandemic. For instance, its policies and messaging towards masking. Aspect 3, public trust and participation. Every Cuban with whom I've spoken trusts the government's work against COVID. Of course, I didn't speak to everyone, nor do I know that everyone was telling me the full truth. I do know that many people participated in health efforts, and I've been struck by the fact that Queens medical students are just now getting the chance to be involved here in Kingston. In Cuba, students are variously involved, and they have been from the beginning. Medical students' primary task is making door-to-door inquiries looking for symptoms. If symptoms are reported, fully trained staff take over. University students have assisted in dorms turned isolation hospitals. Computer science students have created apps to help the distribution of goods. The mathematics faculty has done COVID modeling. Students deliver necessities to the at-risk who are at home, and they have volunteered on farms to grow fresh food. So these examples illustrate some of the ways in which Cuba has been so effective in combating COVID. It has a robust networked medical public health and medical research infrastructure. They deployed protocols and developed therapeutics such as interferons and antivirals quickly. They developed alternatives to internationally available tools that are too expensive, like respirators and even difficult to get swabs. Cuba's experience treating infectious disease, including COVID, in other countries with its medical brigades. Those are the Henry Reeve brigades that have been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. That knowledge meant that from abroad could be used early on domestically. There's public confidence in the Cuban government's science-based policies. Media messaging gives explicit information that aims to motivate action rather than raising alarm. And inhabitants are encouraged to be involved. generally through pre-existing organizations?
I think we are having a problem with, I lost Jen for a while because I think that she's having a problem with her connection. So I'm trying to contact her, see if she can come back.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Sorry for that. Okay, being unprepared to create, produce, and distribute vaccines is a market-driven, politicized choice that is detrimental to the world's public. Tiny blockaded Cuba is the only Latin American country with the capacity to manufacture a vaccine domestically other than Brazil, which is not doing so at all. Cuba is running phase 3 international clinical trials of Soberana, Sovereignty 2, and Abdala, the other one, and producing these vaccine candidates, they're still candidates on a massive scale. The start of intervention trials mean that most of Havana's inhabitants should be vaccinated by May. All of Cuba should be vaccinated by the end of the year. Work is continuing on other candidates, Soberana 1, Mambisa, and the booster Soberana Plus. China and Cuba are working on pan-corona for future variants. Nasoferon, which is a nose spray interferon alpha 2B preventative, is being tested. Cuba aims to protect its populace first, and then Cuba will give away and sell its vaccines abroad. Technology transfer is beginning. Cuba is supplying Ghana with pharmaceutical ingredients for vaccine formulation and production. Of course, I'm thinking about the vaccine situation in Canada. The recently hyped news that Sanofi will, in a few years, be producing influenza vaccines in Canada again is too little too late. Sanofi absorbed Canada's Cannot national labs when Cannot was sold off in the 1890s. 1980s, wow, in the 1980s. Cannot's policies were similar to Cuba's national labs. It provided for domestic consumption first. Cannot then sold its vaccines in the global market and was financially viable doing so. And I thank Marjorie in Ottawa for pointing out this parallel to me. So aspect 4, vaccine, case study Cuba, and what needs to be done. Vaccine development and production must be in public hands, and it must be internationally open source, that is patent-free. If every factory capable of producing vaccine were producing it, we could vaccinate everyone and get ahead of the virus and its mutations. At the speed we're vaccinating now, we're moving very slowly and very painfully from pandemic to endemic. To add insult to injury, once COVID is endemic, pharmaceutical companies will be allowed to charge much more for the vaccine. Indeed, makers have already promised their shareholders that they will do so. They will also earn yearly on inoculations made necessary because infighting nurtured the disease. It is false that private companies take the risk in vaccine development and production, and so they deserve windfall profits. Vaccines are produced with public money. Pfizer, through its European partner BioNTech, received $445 million from the German government. The US government provided Moderna about $1 billion and Johnson & Johnson over $1.45 billion. Not-for-profit systems get us vaccines most quickly. Countries with national labs like Cuba, China, India, Russia, perhaps Finland, they're in the front of the pack with trusted technology, affordable vaccines that are easy to make and administer. There's never been much money in vaccines, and that's why they don't get developed except in global pandemics. That's why it took so long for an Ebola vaccine, for instance, and why that vaccine is under-administered. There is no money in getting a vaccine to poor countries like Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. Notably as well, racism might be involved here. So what we as global citizens need to do now is to push our leaders to share vaccine recipes, ingredients, and know-how. So technology transfer like Cuba is doing with Ghana. There must be an emergency waiver of the intellectual property rules. And to that end, in the document that I'm sending you, I'm including for you 3 open letters that were signed by an impressive array of organizations asking to end the pandemic through a waiver of TRIPS, which is the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, so that more vaccines and treatment can be produced quickly. Also addresses for you to send your own letters and a batch of articles about intellectual property and vaccines. There's a lot of information out there now, suddenly, happily. Concretely, right now, we still need to support COVAX that helps low socioeconomic status countries get vaccinated. And we need to militate for a waiver of intellectual property rights in order to vaccinate more quickly. Looking forward, we need disaster preparedness protocols in place that privilege human health over market health and community needs over individual desires. In pandemics, distinctions between these poles dissolve. Our policies need to account for this. We need international open source collaboration, an international network of researchers and developers supported by public funds that keep us ready for the next big one. Investigators know more or less what's coming down the pike. It's just that under the current for-profit system, we ignore their recommendations. We need to control climate change that is increasing the frequency of pandemics and disasters, as per Contagion Cultures talks by Samantha King and Carolyn Prouse. Especially relative to its limited resources and challenging geopolitical positioning, Cuba is on the forefront of COVID mitigation because of its people over profits and its science-first policies. In regards to climate change mitigation, Cuba is working on wind and solar energy, and as part of its contribution to the Paris Agreement, it's collaborating with the UN Green Climate Fund on coastal resilience projects. And while I would say a lot of Cubans really love their cars, and now scooters and electric bikes that are really putting a lot of strain on the energy grid, and also have problems with spare parts, and so it gets a little bit dangerous with explosions and things. But there's still the renaissance of the bicycle, the old-fashioned bicycle. And I'm going to ask Senya to switch to the Masa Critica web page on Facebook to make a bit of an optimistic conclusion by sharing this cartoon that says, I can't complain about the pandemic because thanks to it, I became a cyclist, and I would not change that for anything in the world. So thank you so much, and thanks for your patience with the tech, and I'll hand it over to Senya, who I call Sonia because it's so close, but just in a different language.
Thank you, Jen. We have still a few minutes for questions. If someone in the audience wants to ask, the Q&A is open. Okay, at the beginning of the promotion, I think that there was a moment that we're talking about how the current situation in Cuba, the currency pressures may bring Cuban strategy down. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yes. So yes, thank you. So it's funny when things are changing so fast. So when I submitted that title, I thought that Cuba would not be able to get past the fact that it wouldn't be able to get the hard resources that it needed. Just the simple swabs that were such a nightmare for people to get a hold of. It turns out they're only produced in a few places in the world. Seemed impossible. How is Cuba going to be able to purchase them? How are they going to, because of the blockade, be able to get them? Also, the ventilators, impossible, and vials, and then even for the PCR tests, the different chemicals that you need. And so I thought they're just not going to make it. But it ended up being that they managed. It's funny because I know that I guess this talk might seem very like super duper pro Cuba, but and in a certain way, I guess that it is in regards to the way that they're dealing with this really serious health risk that they really just, they came up with their own ventilators. They figured out how to make some ventilators, and they have swabs and they have PCR tests, and it's amazingly well organized. So then I felt like, well, that title doesn't work very well. I think now, if I would leave that title in, then I would say, well, the economic problems that the pandemic are causing are really problematic for for everybody in Cuba. And there's a weird dichotomy going on that, on one hand, people feel like their government and especially the medical side is doing so well in terms of protecting them with COVID. And then on the other hand, they're standing in interminable lines for the most basic necessities. And there are a lot of tensions around that. And many people feel frustrated about what they see as the necessity of the government to solve that problem. I feel as an outsider, it feels odd, because it feels sometimes like maybe there's not a certain, like a really good sense of just how hard and expensive it is to solve these medical problems, and that the Cuban government is also not all powerful. Many countries are suffering horribly economically. So that's an interesting tension there around hard currency pressures. It'll be interesting to see if the vaccine really comes online and everybody really gets vaccinated, how fast tourism will come back and how much that will help. And although Cuba has said that they won't sell vaccines at very high prices, they will sell at a bit of profit. And what they'll probably do is what they do with the brigades, where the poorer countries get less, they pay less or pay nothing, and people who are richer pay more. So that could be a really strong source of income for them as well.
We have a few questions here. I will tell you the first. Are you comfortable that there are similarities between the successful Cuban approach to HIV/AIDS and their approach to the COVID challenge? And the very same person asked if there are lessons to be learned in more open multi-party democracies from the Cuban approach. Okay. And we have another question. So first, if you are comfortable that there are similarities between the successful Cuban approach to HIV/AIDS and their approach to the COVID challenge.
So that is interesting that Senya and I had a long discussion about the HIV/AIDS and how that was dealt with in Cuba. So critics would say the stigma and the persecution was horrific, and then people that would show the successes of Cuba would say, now Cuba has some of the best medicines out there for HIV, and there are many people that have been living with HIV in Cuba for years because they can have those medicines for free. And then from the point of comparison again with the United States, we know that the United States, when the virus came, there was because of homophobia and money interest, there was very little interest in actually helping people who were living or trying to continue to live with the virus for such a long time. So I hope that helps with that answer. The multi-party democracies from the Cuban approach. I'm not exactly sure what you exactly mean by the question, but I do think that the debate is on one hand, so I can kind of sketch. I think you'll know the debates, but the debates work like this: that on one hand we talk about that Cuba's system is democratic, even though it's one party, because you vote your way up, as it were. Some people say that that's a farce. other people say that a multi-party system would make Cuba more robust. But the critique of that is that there are moneyed interests outside of Cuba, notably in the United States, that basically want regime change now by any means necessary. And so it's not possible to have the same kind of openness or democratic structure of a multi-party system that more powerful countries might have. I'm a bit agnostic about that issue. I would say maybe I'm supposed to have a particular stance on it, but I don't know that I do. I hope I answered your question.
We have still two other questions. There is a question about how is the cooperation with China going? Is there any opening with the current U.S. administration regarding the pandemic? And still another question, so we need to go.
So the cooperation with China going well. China is helping Cuba, for example, with the vaccine development, and they also sent PCR tests and other supplies. So it might be the case that Cuba will increasingly connect with China, although one risks raising the ire of the United States. And typically, I think that China has hesitated to support Cuba for that reason, seeing Cuba in the U.S.'s hemisphere. At the same time, China seems to be doing so much in so many countries, in so many ways that those countries actually appreciate, that maybe China will be changing their policy on Cuba to some extent. And is there any opening with the current administration regarding the pandemic? So everybody has their hopes on Biden that he will change Trump's policy on Cuba. And I think that in regards to the pandemic, the U.S. doesn't really want to help Cuba. I think that solidarity groups do, and they send supplies to Cuba, and which is wonderful, assuming that they get through. And it'll be very interesting to see if Cuba comes up with a vaccine. I guess I doubt the U.S. would purchase it. It would be interesting if Biden starts to allow Americans to travel and flights open up towards Cuba, whether Americans or people from Canada or anywhere else just start to go to Cuba to get vaccinated and go on vacation. I think that Cuba would be very happy about that and would be hoping for that. So to Helen's question, it would be very helpful to see comparative statistics. Where is Cuba placed at incidence and deaths per capita? So I don't have those in my head, and I'll add a link to the document that will allow you to see that. And I'll say overall, death rate is some of the lowest in the world, and incidents are quite low, really, compared to most places in the world, and especially Latin America. And the one point that I would need to make that I didn't make is some people would also say, well, Cuba is an island. And it is the case that islands typically have been doing much better in the pandemic. And we also know that Cuba did very well in the first wave. And they didn't flatten the curve. They just crushed the curve. And then they sort of ran out of money in November. At least that's how we understand it. November, December started to invite tourists, and particularly expatriates who were coming to visit their family for the holidays, that bring remittances and bring gifts and so forth. And what they also unfortunately brought COVID. There was a system of PCR tests that you needed to have negative PCR tests when you arrive, and then quarantine for 5 days, and then take a second PCR test. But that didn't happen because people were seeing their family and they weren't being very careful. Maybe they were science deniers, possibly coming from Miami, or, not to judge, but maybe probability wise that could have an impact. And so there was a spike, and then Cuba's really been suffering since then. So hovering around 1,000 a day, now. They flattened the curve off. It's a table shape. And then I guess there are 11.4 million people in Cuba. So you could do the math. I guess I did get it together with the statistics. I didn't think I had it in my head. Do we have other questions? We're kind of out of time here.
I think that we don't have any other question, and we also need to wrap here. I want to thank you, Jennifer, for your presentation, and to everybody here for coming today, for being here virtually at least, and for engaging actively in this lecture, in this session. So have a good rest of the day and stay safe.